Hello to 176 attendees that we have. Emily, do you hear me? Do you see me okay? Yeah, okay, cool. We're gonna get started. Just a few housekeeping items. We're gonna have fun today. And while we do that, I want you all to remember that we're being recorded. You all are not, but we are. Today's event is being recorded. There are closed captions, so it is on. Our chat is disabled, and we will review the Q&A function throughout the session. In chatting with Emily yesterday, we would love for this to, if there's something that comes to you, if a question comes to you as she is presenting on a specific topic, feel free to add that to the Q&A box. So I have a few things popping up on my screen. Let's dismiss. We do not want to restart right now, so dismiss that. So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Juliet Valdez. I joined the Office of Cultural Change March of this year as the Affirmative Action Manager for the state of Oregon. And our office was established in 2020. And what we do is we partner with agencies, we evaluate and we implement processes to remove systemic barriers throughout the state of Oregon. Now, in my role, I have the opportunity to work with agency leaders, boards, commissions as they develop and build onto their affirmative action plans. Now, early in my career, early 2000s, I worked in public affairs, and that work included ballot initiatives and propositions, including Proposition H. Oh my gosh, Proposition 8. And Emily will share a little bit of history when that comes to that topic. But during that work, I discovered the importance of understanding the intersection of my personal, educational, and my professional experiences, and that the work that I do must be in alignment with my values. Now, as you're listening today to Emily's background, her stories, her knowledge, I encourage you to reflect, question, and really think about where you are in your understanding of gender justice. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce Emily Evans. She's going to drop some amazing knowledge on us today. She was born and raised in Oregon. She has and continues to do work in dismantling gender injustice. We are so excited to welcome you, Emily. I will pass the mic to you and would love for you to share your background and your story, and then go ahead and just dive into what you want to present to us today.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's a delight to be here with everyone. Hello. We're getting some scraps of sunshine in Portland, which I'm very grateful for. And it's really nice to be able to round out Pride Month, just getting to talk with my state employee folks. Listen, I'm an MPA kid from way back, so I'm a bureaucrat at heart, and I just really am so stoked to get to spend this time with y'all. Like Juliet said, I was born and raised in Oregon, in Ashland, and then I did a long swing on the East Coast, gathering various degrees, working at various national orgs, and then about 8 years ago, I was able to come home to Oregon. And for 7 of the past 8 years that I've spent back at home, I was the executive director of the Women's Foundation of Oregon, which was a tremendous opportunity, and got to sort of really continue to dig in really deep on gender justice, and particularly gender justice in Oregon. And now I run a small consulting firm that focuses on helping organizations and leaders within organizations really make their workplaces a great place to be for all genders. Yeah, I also just really want this to be a dialogue as much as we can manage that in a virtual space of 400 folks. So please yammer, ask questions. I've asked Juliet to please just interrupt as we go along. I don't think there's any point in me answering a question that you have 40 minutes from now. I don't think that's helpful. So please ask them as we go along, and I'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. I also have to apologize slightly in advance. There is a very small chance that my dog will need to go outside. She's having a bout of giardia. I don't know if any dog lovers out there have gone through that, but it's an unpleasant time. So if she really needs to go out, I might just walk back and then I'll be back in a minute. These are the times we find ourselves in virtual spaces. Great. So I think, Juliet, if you're down, we can start with the first slide. Terrific. Okay, so what we're sorting out today is sexual orientation and gender identity, the ways those are connected and not, what we mean when we say them. As you can see, we're going to go through sort of terms and key concepts, a bit of data at the statewide level, some milestones and important pieces of history, and then a piece that I think will hopefully appeal to everybody, which is how to show up in allyship to LGBTQ folks in your workplace, and how to show up in allyship for yourself in terms of intersectionality. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Oh, there's my gay face at the center of the rainbow. As a way of identifying, I use she, her pronouns. I'm a cisgender white woman. I identify as gender nonconforming, so I'm pretty masculine. And I am going to be marrying my partner in August. And we have 2 kiddos and the aforementioned dog who is struggling with giardia. And it is a pleasure to be here with you all today. Okay, next one. All right. So let's start by getting on the same page with our language and our key concepts. What do we even mean when we say gender? What do we mean when we say sex? What do we mean by sexual orientation? What does gender justice even mean in this context? So this diagram is a super helpful one, and we're actually going to break it down bit by bit by bit. But before we get into the specifics of the definitions, there's 2 things that I really, really want folks to focus on. The number one is that binary notions of gender, that there's just 2 options and nothing else, are a product of dominant culture and colonization. It is actually, prior to the spread of European colonialism, the notion of a binary gender concept just didn't exist in most indigenous communities. There were often 3-4 genders. Sometimes gender was not really a construct at all, not really a helpful construct. So we actually are dealing with something that's relatively recent and was very, until, the middle of the like 1400s, was very contained to one geographic area. So binary notions are really a product of colonization. What we now understand to be the case is much more on spectrums, which you see here, as we know so many things are. I'm sure that y'all in most of your workplaces have some things that exist on spectrums, and that's what we're talking about here. So number one, binary is a recent concept and is totally made up. Number 2, and this is really key, where any person falls on any of these 4 spectrums that I'm about to talk about has 0 bearing with where they fall on any of the other 3 spectrums. Now, this is kind of a little bit mind-blowing because we are told from birth that where we fall on the top one, sex assigned at birth, should determine where we fall on all of the rest of them. But that, again, is a concept that is been totally debunked, but is very, very much in our minds. So we'll talk about the ways that we are able to parse those out. Okay, let's start with the first one. So this is biological sex, also called sex assigned at birth. So let's begin at the very beginning. For almost every child born everywhere on the planet, there's a moment when somebody, a doctor, a nurse, a doula, a midwife, a parent, looks at the newborn and declares a biological sex, either male or female. Alok Vaid-Menon, who's an incredible writer and comedian and poet, says that this is the moment when whomever is doing the assigning of sex at birth engages in what he calls genital hieroglyphics, meaning that someone looks very briefly at a tiny bit of anatomy and then tries to divine huge portions of that person's future based on what they see, how they'll look, how they'll identify, who they'll love, which is kind of nuts. Like, very rarely do we look at something very briefly, very small, that's just one part of somebody, and then feel like we can determine a huge amount of their future based on that. And the problems with the categorical binary, so we often think, okay, well, all right, Emily, sure, I'll go with you on the other spectrum. There are spectrums, they're not a binary, but this is pretty black and white. It's either male or female. We're talking about anatomy, we're talking about genetics. Turns out, nature disagrees with you. The problems with the categorical binary start right out of the gate with sex assigned at birth, because about 1% of babies are born what we call intersex, meaning that their anatomy is not easily categorized as male or female, either externally or internally. So you're talking about 1 out of 100 babies falling somewhere on this spectrum that is not definitively male or definitively female. And you might try to really double down on that binary and say, listen, okay, fine, maybe anatomically it's indeterminate, but what do the genetics say? What do the genes and the DNA say? Surely it must be 100% clear all the time whether folks are male or female when it comes to genetics. Nope. About 1 in 1,000 babies have chromosomes that aren't strictly male or female either. So even nature, even what folks who have really colonized thinking in terms of a gender binary are resisted by just anatomical realities and genetic realities. It is not a binary, it is a spectrum. And in the middle of this particular spectrum are folks who are intersex or who have genetics that don't easily line up with male or female chromosomes. All right. So we just made up that binary, but man, we really bought into it. So let's look at how it shows up in the next one.
Hey, Emily, we have a question about the use of pronouns.
Great.
I'm just gonna go ahead and read it out loud. Yeah. So
Sure.
Can we encourage an acceptable pronoun group that doesn't use the plural form that addresses one person? Using they for one person is so against our fierce grammar instructors. And so it is painful for many of us to incorporate in our communications. Thank you for considering, help us with better options.
Totally. I mean, I get it. Like I was a real grammar stickler and still am in some ways. I don't know if anybody else out there is a Oxford comma loyalists, but really believe in that. And what I have to say with this is I wish there was a single person gender neutral pronoun. I do. And we don't have a good one. There have been lots of folks who are trying to come up with alternatives, and that's great. Maybe eventually one will stick. But in the meantime, I think we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable with they, because ultimately I think it's a question of who benefits and who burdens and who bears harm and who doesn't. And I would rather have the pain, and I feel it is pain of feeling like things are grammatically incorrect rather than making people feel invisible or gendered when they don't want to be. So and I think also like the more we practice it, probably the better we'll get at it. And it's also interesting to note that the discomfort we feel when trying to use something like they, or saying like, for instance, people with uteruses rather than women, is because there isn't the language itself has been colonized. It has been deployed in ways that are very easy for us to piece apart in this binary. So it's as if the language itself almost resists it by being sort of clunky or not fitting into the norms of what we think it is, or it requires 6 or 7 words to describe what a more harmful word might do in 1 syllable. And that is sort of indicative of the problem. The language reflects the fact that we have bought into this binary at a linguistic level. So I encourage folks to get comfortable being uncomfortable with the plural pronoun. And that might not be a satisfying answer, but I appreciate the question. Okay, let's talk about gender identity. So we have sex assigned at birth, genital hieroglyphics. Now we're talking about gender identity, and this is how you feel on the inside. This has, in some cases, a lot to do with your body or the sex assigned at birth, and in a lot of cases, absolutely nothing to do with that. So on gender identity, you can feel like a man on the inside, you can feel like a woman on the inside, or you can feel genderqueer or non-binary, not fitting into either of those categories. And here's where we get into the language around cis and trans. Those are categorical distinctions within gender identity. And cis actually comes from a root that just means in alignment with. So if you are a cis man, then your gender identity as a man is in alignment with your assigned male at birth. If you're a cis woman, your gender identity on the inside, conceiving of yourself as a woman, is in alignment with being assigned female at birth. That's cis. And the other side of the coin from that is trans. And trans is, again, a root that just means crossing. It means crossing over. So that's what we would describe as a trans man who is actually assigned female at birth, but on the inside identifies as a man, or a trans woman who is assigned male at birth, but their gender identity crosses over into something different than they were assigned at birth. And now, again, this is a wide spectrum. You can have trans and cis folks that identify as men or women, and you can have folks that identify as genderqueer or non-binary or not falling into any of those categories. So the key thing here is this is what you know yourself to be on the inside. And the only person who gets to make that determination is you. So we have sex assigned at birth and gender identity. Let's take the next layer of what we might call this sort of SOGI sandwich. My buddy Sirius helps me remember. So SOGI is sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. SOGI, like hoagie. And it's so helpful because it comes in layers, just like a sandwich. Okay, gender expression. This is how you present yourself on the outside to the world. So this is on a spectrum from masculine to feminine, and in the middle we have androgynous or non-binary. This is things like how you wear your hair, what kind of clothes you wear, whether or not and how you wear any makeup, how you speak and walk, how you carry yourself through the world, how you ask folks to refer to you in terms of pronouns or names, what hobbies you have, how you relate to other people. This is the manifestation of your gender expression on the outside. And I know it seems wild, but this is a completely distinct spectrum from the other two that we've spoken about. We'll get back to that in a minute, but that's the thing I hope people to hold really close when we're doing these layers of gender expression, gender identity, and sex and sexual orientation. So this is the spectrum of masculine to feminine. And we'll come back to that in a minute too. All right. And now here's our last one. This is sexual orientation. This is who you like or who you love or who you're attracted to. And this can operate on a number of levels. It can be physical attraction, it can be emotional attraction, romantic attraction. And this exists on a spectrum from heterosexual up through gay and lesbian. And there's also all kinds of other variants, bisexual, pansexual, asexuality, and they don't neatly fit tidily into categories. So this has absolutely nothing to do with who you identify as on the inside. This is about who you're attracted to in the world. So we go to our next slide and revisit our layers of our SOGI hoagie, and we have sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And those are the layers. It's multi-layered, and each one is a spectrum unto itself. So the way dominant culture conceives of gender identity and sexual orientation, an analogy might be like being born with a certain hair color and then saying that the baby's hair color also 100% determines its adult height, whether or not they're left or right-handed, and whether or not they like Brussels sprouts. Those things aren't related. Those things are totally not related to one another. Getting worked up about it. But now imagine that if the baby's height, dominant hand, and Brussels sprout preference went against what was predicted by its hair color, we would then discriminate the heck out of them for it, because they didn't align with what we thought that they should or would align with, when in fact, those things don't have anything to do with one another. So I have like little arrows that help share where I fall on each of these spectra. And I encourage folks to take a minute and think about where you might fall or a loved one might fall. So I was assigned female at birth. My gender identity is a woman. So those two things are in alignment. So I'm a cis woman. My gender expression is much more on the masculine to androgynous side. So that is out of alignment with what people would expect from my sex assigned at birth and my gender identity. But for me, it works great. And then on the spectrum of orientation, I'm real gay. Again, because I was assigned female at birth and I am interested and attracted to women, that makes me deviant from what we would expect somebody who is assigned female at birth.
Okay, so I'm going to just, I guess, make an announcement first that there are a lot of great comments and questions coming through. I apologize in advance. We're not going to be able to get through it because Emily has great information here, and I think some of your questions that are coming through might be answered as we move forward. So I will then pass it back to you, Emily.
Great. Okay, so now let's dive down in a couple other terms. Let's start with the term gender justice. So really, this goes back to our layers and what gender justice, a world of pure, unadulterated gender justice, would be a reality where nothing related to a person's gender, what they were assigned at birth, their identity, expression, orientation, anything, has any bearing on their ability to thrive. We see no meaningful difference at all on any of those spectra that where no matter where you fall, you might have different life outcomes. Gender justice is also inherently intersectional, and therefore it can only be achieved when all forms of oppression cease to exist. And we'll talk about intersectionality in a moment. But the thing that I'm hoping that folks take from this is that gender justice is really a broad concept that encompasses everything about sexism, the patriarchy, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, heteronormativity. It encompasses all of those things because ultimately all of those forms of oppression are fruits from the same poison tree. And that poison tree is the expectation that people will line up very tidily on the sides of that layer cake that I showed of where their sex was assigned at birth. Everything that comes out from there, anything that relates to people's oppression, given where they fall on those spectra and whether or not it deviates from where people think they should fall, is gender injustice. So anybody that says that just your garden variety sexism and homophobia aren't at all related does not have their head wrapped all the way around what we mean by gender justice and gender injustice. Okay, let's get to that intersectionality bit. This is my favorite word and my favorite concept and my favorite antidote to so many forms of harmful reductive oppression. Intersectionality. This is the concept that various marginalized identities and characteristics intersect with one another to form a unique and individualized experience of oppression. It was coined by the renowned legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw Williams, and it was further popularized by Patricia Hill Collins. It is important to note for my math folks out there, it isn't linear. So say you're a person of color and say you're a queer person. Those things intersect in a unique way that doesn't mean 2 + 2 = 4. It actually means 2 + 2 = 57, because your experience of 2 or more marginalized identities are interacting with one another and compounding one another in intense and unique ways. So when we understand that facets of everybody's identity intersect to create a unique experience, we can understand that all forms of oppression are in some ways bound up with one another. And therefore, liberation and freedom and justice is bound up in one another as well. Okay.
Hey, Emily.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, are you open to sharing this PowerPoint or this presentation to anyone that's interested? Okay. Totally. And that had come in on the Q&A if it's going to be available. So
yeah, absolutely. Happy to.
Awesome.
Okay. Now let's talk about masculine and feminine. So I have this set of traits here, these traits that are traditionally masculine and traits that are traditionally feminine, all kinds of good stuff, bunches and bunches of things here. In fact, if I gave you an adjective, I bet most folks would be able to categorize it based on masculine or feminine. In English, we don't have masculine and feminine nouns or words in general like most Romance languages. They categorize almost all words into masculine and feminine. But the important thing here is, again, we made it all up. We made it all up. There is nothing inherently masculine or inherently feminine about any of these things or their relationship to one another. My 8-year-old daughter told me the other day, did you know that in the Victorian era, blue was for girls and pink was for boys? She was shocked, right? That something unthinkably permanent, like which color is for which gender, could be totally arbitrary and totally changed based on the whims of a given time period. But that's what we have here. And there's deep harm done to every human to think that there are some emotions, some traits, some characteristics that are available to them because of their gender or their sex assigned at birth, and some that aren't. So we are essentially asking our children and then our adults to cut themselves off from a huge portion of their human experience that's theirs, that's their birthright. And that is a form of painful cleaving that happens really, really early on. I'm sure all of us can remember back to elementary school when particularly like what we would consider feminine boys were called names or bullied, or when tomboys or girls that were gender nonconforming were also punished in all kinds of ways. So it's not so much the categorization that is the root of the problem. It's the dehumanizing of folks that cross those categorizations. And the message to our children and our adults all the way up through late in life, that there are some things that are not for them because of their sex assigned at birth. Okay, let's talk about heteronormativity and cis heteronormativity. I love this, this questionnaire. This is important for folks who identify as heterosexual. What do you think caused it? When and where did you decide you were heterosexual? Is it possible this is just sort of a heterosexual phase and you'll grow out of it? Do your parents know you're straight? Do your friends know? How did everybody react? I'm not sure why you insist on flaunting your heterosexuality. Could you just kind of be who you are and keep quiet? Why do heterosexuals try to recruit others into this lifestyle? So obviously this is very tongue-in-cheek, but I'm not kidding you, and I'm sure all my queer siblings here on the call can attest. We have all been asked these questions by parents, often when coming out, even if it's not malintended. We get interrogated about this difference a lot in ways that heterosexual folks would never be. That's why this is such a goofy kind of joke, right? So we call this heteronormativity. Cis, meaning we expect everybody to line up with their gender, with their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. And heteronormativity, meaning the presumption that everybody is straight and that anything that deviates from that is the aberrant thing. And we'll just organize the world around straightness. This leads very closely to homophobia, which is sort of tied in with that concept of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity being like the normal, typical thing that we will design the entire world around is straightness, and homophobia meaning we're afraid of folks that have a queer sexual orientation. Are we on? This is perhaps the greatest. Let's move to the next slide that has the skeletons. Perhaps the greatest slide of our time. You'll note here that these skeletons are not anatomically correct. So we are, of course, unless I think you're, a forensic anthropologist, it's very difficult to determine gender based on skeletal remains. So whoever designed this photo was so deeply freaked out about the possibility that the skeletons might be perceived as queer that they put on bone titties. Right? That real worried about it. We will make up anatomy to conform with heteronormativity and to prevent us from having to feel the fear of homophobia.
Emily, someone had put a question in a few minutes ago. How does this intersect with compulsory heterosexuality?
Mm-hmm. I think I would call that sort of heteronormativity on steroids, where you take something like it's not only conceived to be normal, it's conceived like you must participate in this. You don't have a choice of opting out. So like I think of examples of that being like, has anybody ever seen like a toddler wearing like I'm a ladies' man, or like anything that might like be akin to like putting that orientation on very small children? That to me seems like compulsory. Like you must subscribe to this. You don't have a choice not to. And a lot of dehumanizing and a lot of pain comes from that. It's a great question. Okay. So now we've visited the bone titties slide, and we'll actually move into talking a bit about data. So let's talk about LGBTQ plus communities in Oregon. How many folks are we talking about? What do their lives look like? How does it intersect with other forms of oppression? And what does data justice look like in this space? So what we know, and I'll talk a minute about how the data are mostly crap, but our best estimates indicate that there are just over 200,000 queer folks over the age of 13 in Oregon. This is roughly the population of Jackson County, which is the county that I was born in. Go Jackson County. Medford, Ashland, Phoenix, Talent. It's the 6th largest county in Oregon. That's a lot of folks. And that doesn't count folks under the age of 13 who increasingly identify as some form of LGBTQIA. So we're talking about a pretty substantive chunk of the state. I think that number tends to surprise folks. And that means absolutely, without a doubt, wherever you are in state government, wherever you are situated, you are in some capacity serving queer folks. So this is not something that we can sort of like tidily set aside or just assume doesn't interact with our agency. Statistically, it's impossible. All state agencies are going to interact and serve queer folks in some capacity. What we know about the lives of queer folks in Oregon, in 2019 data, we know that most LGBTQ students, 88% in Oregon, said they regularly hear anti-queer or homophobic remarks. We know that 60% of Oregon's elder queer adult population have experienced some form of discrimination. We know that 1/3 of queer adults have difficulty paying bills or buying nutritious meals due to financial instability. We also know that many queer Oregonians hold multiple overlapping marginalized identities. So when you combine the experience of racism, ableism, xenophobia with the experience of homophobia, it has a compounding effect, just like intersectionality, that is greater than the sum of its parts. So we also know that the more overlapping layers of oppression that you have, the worse your life outcomes. So if you are a trans woman of color that was born into poverty and is neuroatypical, your life outcomes are exponentially worse than folks who fall into just one of those categories or none of those categories. I also want to point out, those are sort of deficit-based components. Oregon has extraordinary queer communities that are contributing to make our state strong and livable, our communities strong, our kids healthy and strong. The amount that queer Oregonians are contributing to our communities and to our state is really high. And I'm helping right now with the data gathering project. I think that will make even more of that clear, that on the one hand, queer Oregonians are experiencing a lot of pain and oppression related to homophobia and institutional homophobia. And on the other hand, they're giving an extraordinary amount to make the state strong and vibrant. And I also want to talk about data in particular on queer communities. So you have probably noticed from the shortness of this slide, we don't have very much high quality data on queer folks. And the vast majority, it's pretty important to understand the context in which that exists or the lack of data exists. So the first is the vast majority of data that has ever been collected on queer communities in Oregon and otherwise has been gathered, often illegally, with the explicit intent to harm. And people's lives, families, businesses, communities have been torn apart by data collection efforts where the intent was to harm and to pathologize. And that means that all future data collection efforts will be fraught necessarily because of that painful history. The other side of that coin is that under dominant culture systems, and particularly when you talk about public policy, data is often required to prove the experience of hardship and oppression, or even just the nature of everyday life. So without it, the struggles of queer folks remain relatively invisible and largely unaddressed by policymakers and other decision makers. So it's a very fraught, data collection for queer communities is super fraught. because we really need it, and we deserve to be seen, and we deserve to have our concerns validated and held by people who are making decisions about our lives and our communities. On the other hand, it has been painfully used in the past to harm us. So I think that whenever we think about queer data going forward, we really have to hold both of those things. And I don't believe they're irreconcilable, but I do think we have to come in really knowing the history of what data looks like and why we are where we are with queer data at the state level.
Hey, Emily, are we on the right slide? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay,
we're on the right
all right.
slide, and now we're ready to go to the next slide.
Okay, cool.
So since we got our terrific state employees here on the call, I thought I'd go into the policies and laws in Oregon that that we have on the books, so that folks have a sense of kind of what we're talking about and where they fall. So Oregon has really strong legal protections and policy supports for queer folks, for queer families, for queer youth. We have marriage for same-sex couples, joint adoption, bans on conversion therapy, non-discrimination laws that cut across a number of areas, no religious exemptions for any of the above, anti-bullying legislation, anti-hate crime laws, trans-supportive healthcare policies, changeable and non-binary options for driver's licenses, birth certificates. We're doing pretty good on a lot of these things, and that deserves to be celebrated. Before I leave this slide, though, I also think it's really important to note that all of these things are wonderful and they address certain and specific inequities in the queer experience. But what we know from the data is that simply being queer is a risk factor and is predictive of worse life outcomes across the board. So these are important, and that having like great hate crime legislation and bans on conversion therapy and letting folks get married doesn't solve all of the negative impacts of what it means to be queer. I hope that that makes sense. These things are wonderful, and they don't encompass the full nature of the inequity that is heteronormatively designed systems. And I'll give you an example. My partner and I are getting married. That's terrific. Up until then, we've been domestic partners. I'm on her health insurance. She's a state employee. Go state of Oregon. But as part of that, because we're domestic partners, she actually has to pay taxes on the healthcare premiums that get paid for me. So her tax liability, and this is weird and small or whatever, it's like, I don't know, a couple $100 a year, kind of tedious, whatever. But it shows the way that the heteronormativity is baked into every single layer of these systems. And it takes much more than just a slide of policies like this to truly combat them. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about how Oregon ranks relative to other states. It's really quite good. This is the Movement Advancement Project, which is a wonderful resource that kind of highlights various state policies and how they relate to one another. Oregon's doing pretty darn good, And you can go and see the whole breakout and report card about which policies in particular they take into account, where and how they show up in Oregon. It's really great work. Let me go to the next slide, and we'll show you. We'll show you how we compare to the rest of the country. And for those folks that have been watching Supreme Court decisions recently, you'll note some pretty clear patterns, along with a lot of other policy pieces. But I think it's not, given what we talked about earlier about everything related to sexism and gender injustice all coming as like fruits from the same poison tree, this map that is particularly about anti-queer policies tracks very closely to anti-reproductive health policies. That's the Movement Advancement Project's work. I highly recommend folks check them out. Okay, let's talk about milestones. Yay. Okay, so there are like tons and tons of milestones. We could go way back, way back. We go all the way back to Greece, Sappho. But I said, actually, let's go from the middle of the 20th century forward, because that's sort of within lived memory of most of the folks on this call. So the Stonewall riots were June 28th, 1969. It's important to note that Pride actually started as a riot based on a police raid of a queer space. So I love Pride. I love the parade. I love the rainbows. I love all of it. And it started as a violent response to mortal danger and long-term persecution. by the police state against queer folks. In 1978, Harvey Milk was assassinated. He was the San Francisco elected official for the city of San Francisco, who was one of the first openly queer folks and did tremendous early policy work in San Francisco and in California. In the 1980s, we have the HIV and AIDS epidemic that at the highest political levels wasn't even spoken about in the Reagan administration at any point, even as it was absolutely decimating queer and other communities.
Hey, Emily.
Yeah.
I think before we move forward, we have some questions about using the term queer.
Mm-hmm.
And can you maybe elaborate more and share, because some of the questions that are coming through, one is that it seems like we're using the term queer as a catch-all, and yeah, educate us. Tell us a little bit more about.
Yeah, totally. I think this is idiosyncratic. I think LGBTQIA plus, like there are acronyms that even then don't get to the like enormity of the non-straight, like cis experience. I do use it as a catch-all. It tends to be a little bit, I view it as anything that transgresses the alignment that we talked about at the beginning as an umbrella term. And a lot of folks agree with me on that, and a lot of folks don't. I think this is a really important function, which is that folks who spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff and who could be considered to be experts can and do disagree about some of this stuff, and that's okay. And there's, I think, a generative and productive dialogue there. I'll actually talk about in the allyship section about like one of the best ways we can honor and show up as allies is to use the language that people use about themselves. Just reflect that language. So it would be perfectly fine if somebody used queer for me. But if somebody didn't care for that term and they made that clear, then it wouldn't be okay for me to use that term for them, because that isn't reflective of how they think about or describe themselves. Awesome. Thoughtful questions. I appreciate it. So then we have, in the mid-90s, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the policy put in place in the Clinton administration for folks in the armed services, saying that we wouldn't ask and we wouldn't tell. But that didn't stop a lot of queer folks in the armed services being prosecuted and unfairly discharged. Related to that was the Defense of Marriage Act, also another gem from the Clinton era, that essentially what we know about the way that our United States functions is that we call it the full faith and credit clause, and you all are aware of this, that rights and privileges given to folks within one state or at the federal level transfer to other states and to the federal level. So you don't need a new driver's license every time you enter a new state, for instance, because your Oregon driver's license is given full faith and credit. Well, people were real freaked when some states started allowing same-sex couples to marry, that they would have to honor that marriage in their state. So the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, was passed to say, okay, JK, you don't have to give full faith and credit to Vermont, Massachusetts, Maryland, these states that were early adopters of allowing same-sex couples to marry. These were terrible policies. And then in the 90s, we also saw a huge number of state-level marriage bans. So literally states writing into their constitutions that same-sex couples couldn't get married, which at that point, I mean, it sounds kind of quaint now, but at the time it was very weird to write discrimination into your state constitution at that late stage in the game. There were multiple ones here in Oregon, which I'll talk about in a minute. They were all over the country. And then in 2003, Lawrence versus Texas actually strikes down the constitutionality of sodomy laws. So it's no longer illegal for two consensual adults to engage however they wish with one another. And then finally, Obergefell versus Hodges at the Supreme Court establishes marriage equality for everybody in every state. And DOMA kind of takes the back seat because everybody can do it and everybody's marriage is given full faith and credit. And then in 2016, you have the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. And in 2021, the Supreme Court actually passed a pretty strong set of non-employment discrimination protections for queer folks, interpreting rightly that any discrimination based on gender also relates to discrimination based on queer folks. Okay, let's talk about Oregon queer milestones. Portland's first public pride celebration is in 1975. In 82, we had the first AIDS-related death in Oregon. In 87, at the state and city level, there are quite a few non-discrimination clauses passed for state and city employees. And it's interesting because I think as we look at the sort of how rights have grown or rolled up, we often see it starting with public employees, because that's often what administrative or executive branches have authority over. So that's often a harbinger for things to come. Gail Shibley becomes the first openly lesbian state legislator in 1991. There are a ton of anti-gay ballot measure efforts, 8, 9, 13. Oh, y'all, this is a sweet little personal story. When I was in college, my dad, he would grow big pumpkins. Has anybody seen those? Just giant. They're like the size of, you could fit like 2, 3 toddlers in them. Huge pumpkins, right? And this one year, he planted a bunch, but he only got one. Just one giant pumpkin. And I think the anti-gay ballot measure that year was 36. And I was at school on the East Coast, and he sends a picture, and I open it up, and he's carved his one giant pumpkin into a giant jack-o'-lantern that had a "No on 36" sign on it. I was pretty stoked. I was like, all right, Dad, that's allyship, that you gave your one giant pumpkin to the towards defeating this ballot measure. We have in 94 Basic Rights Oregon, which is our statewide advocacy group for LGBTQ folks. The Supreme Court rules against same-sex marriage in 2005. Of course, that is obviated by later policies, particularly Obergefell. Sam Adams becomes the first openly gay major city mayor in 2008, and Stu Rasmussen becomes the first openly trans mayor in the US, down in Silverton. I think that Sam Adams and the size of Portland election kind of like took over what was actually a much bigger milestone, which is having an openly trans mayor. And in 2021, Darcel Drag Club was added to the National Register of Historic Places. So again, some of these are tough milestones, some of these are great milestones, and some of them are just fun. All right, let's use our last bit of minutes before we get to Q&A to talk about allyship. I hope that I have lots of LGBTQ siblings here on the call, but I'm guessing there are a lot of you who don't identify as trans or as queer or as any type of non-straight. So let's talk about how you might be able to show up for folks in the workplace in particular. So we define allyship, or I define allyship, as using the power or privilege granted to you by your identity to render a form of service or solidarity to an individual or group who holds less power or privilege. So it's using the power or privilege granted to you simply by your identity. So that could be your cis identity, or your straight identity, or your male or masculine identity. Anytime when you have privilege, you can show up and do a form of service or solidarity to somebody who has less privilege. And that's allyship. So I have appreciated lots of questions about language and pronouns in particular. Honoring pronouns is terrific. And if you're already using them in your meetings, in your email signature, as part of your greetings, or in gathering spaces, that's wonderful. And there are lots of additional steps to take to support trans and queer folks in your workplace. So for instance, you can foster empathy. If you're a straight cis person, understanding that queer and trans folks face realities that you never have and never will is really key to sort of being empathetic to the queer experience. Your ability to legally marry your partner will never be in question. Your ability to safely exist in your body walking down the street will never routinely be in question. Your ability just to go to the bathroom in a facility that confirms what you know to be true about yourself is not in question, and certainly wouldn't be a matter of state legislators prohibiting that from happening. So fostering empathy. Next is working on leveling up your analysis. So no matter what the nature of your work is, continuously asking yourself how queer and trans folks might be either harmed or helped depending on the decisions made by you and your colleagues. We all have our own small spheres of influence, and I'm I know for a fact that like every part of state government touches queer and trans folks. So that means every part of state government has the ability to affirm and support queer and trans folks, or the ability to harm, hurt, isolate, and other queer and trans folks. So bringing that analysis to your work and to your community every day is tremendous. You can also sort of pursue your own learning about trans and queer and gender justice to help build up your analysis and your ability to apply that in your sphere of influence. Next one is to mind your language. Using whatever terms or language or labels that people use about themselves when you are describing them or talking about them. So sort of reflecting what you hear about how people describe themselves. Now there's an important caveat here. There are some words that are not okay for folks who do not share that identity to use. And we know this across racial lines, we know this across other lines. There was one Christmas, again, my dad, where I referred to myself as like a big dyke or something. And then he used that language and I was like, oh, Dad, that's not for you to use. He goes, yeah, it didn't feel right when it came out. I was like, thanks, Dad. So the one caveat to using reflective language is to be very clear that any language that has been used to harm or hurt communities is really up to them how they use it, and it's not your language to use. You can also use gender neutral and inclusive language in your writing and in your speech. Say folks or y'all instead of guys, gals, or ladies and gentlemen. Say spouse or partner instead of husband or wife. And strive to replace assumptions and particularly stereotypes with respectful curiosity. So if you aren't sure about something, think of a way that you might be able to respectfully ask, or think about how important it is that you have an answer to that question in that moment. A stance of respectful curiosity, I find, goes a really, really long way.
There are a lot of questions coming through, Emily.
Good, yeah.
So here's one. What if someone doesn't want to share their pronoun? And it says, this person is concerned and a little bit worried about in the past that sharing and asking for pronouns is invasive. So, what if they're transitioning? Are we creating a situation where people could be uncomfortable?
Totally. So let's take a minute and honor the fact that that sucks, right? That sucks to be in a context where you feel like you can't be real about your pronouns or your identity or what's happening for you and your body. Like that's a stinky thing to have to deal with. So holding a lot of compassion for folks who find themselves in that circumstance. I think that my general stance around folks who are going through that kind of hardship is that they got to do what they need to do to take care of themselves and stay safe. And I'm not going to be out here telling them that they need to be out and proud about it if that isn't where they're at. I think that there are lots of respectful ways to decline that. And actually, the next slide we'll talk specifically about my number one core thing for being a good ally. But if folks are like, no, I'm not super comfortable with sharing pronouns, or I'm not really down to talk about that, that's fine. Just honoring that is great. And I think this gets back to this sense of like, smart, good folks who have similar identities or similar levels of expertise can and do disagree about some of this stuff. Some folks think that it's really invasive to ask for pronouns. Okay, heard. Other folks think it's incredibly important and makes it very gives folks a sense of belonging and cuts against the heteronormativity and the transphobia that is just constantly surrounding us. So I think these are generative discussions, and I think like being in kind, curious, and compassionate relationship with one another goes a really long way when we're dealing with these nuances that aren't always black and white. That's a great question. Okay, so we're on the last couple here. If you're a manager or in senior leadership, consider undertaking an audit, either formal or informal, about the queer and trans employees' experience on your organization and your team. Listen to their experiences without defensiveness, believe them, and take action to improve their experience. There's lots of like formal and informal ways to do this. And again, if that is experienced as invasive by folks on your team, that's totally fair and you can honor it. There's ways to do this with consultants, but really just listening to the experience of queer and trans folks in your organization is a great place to start, because they live it every day and they'll be able to tell you what is and isn't working for them and what is and isn't supportive of queer and trans folks in the workplace. So you can also check in with HR about queer and trans affirming policies and benefits at your organization, and sort of like get a sense of that. Like, all right, great, I'm bought into pronouns, or I'm bought into using inclusive language. How else are we showing up as an organization to support our queer and trans employees and our queer and trans clients or citizens that we're serving? And the last one is to vote and buy and attend and consume with a lot of intention. So voting in ways that affirm queer and trans rights and dignity, and then just buying and attending and consuming writing, art, music, performances, social media that's made by LGBTQ folks. I have found that, like, you know, you sort of passively taking in social media, you know, most of us are kind of, you know, every now and then. And if you can add in these dynamic pieces of other experiences that are maybe not yours, it really can be like frankly, kind of a cheap and easy way to improve your analysis and to expand your thinking about a particular thing that you maybe don't think about all the time. So I think that's a pretty great one. Okay. We'll hop to questions after this, but now's my number one indicator of a good ally. And this cuts across any form of allyship at all, not just queer and trans allyship. How do you respond when you are called in or out? This is so key. So I think it's human nature to be defensive. It's human nature, especially if you actually do care about the person or the group that you're being called in or out about. You normally get like spicy pits, hot face, not feeling great. And I would say that the number one thing you can do as an ally is to take those feelings, set them aside, and listen when somebody who's experiencing that marginalization invites you to understand it in a different way, particularly if you've done harm. And I can tell you without a doubt, if you deal with that gracefully and with an intent to repair the relationship and an intent to improve going forward, that's incredible allyship, and probably the biggest and best way that any of us can ever show up in terms of allyship. All right, I would love more questions.
So there are a lot of questions. What I've been doing, y'all, I've copied and pasted everything onto a Word doc. And Emily, I would love to work with you in going through these questions. Maybe we'll type it up and then we could add it to when we share the PowerPoint presentation. Because here's the thing, there are a lot of good questions here, but there's a lot to unpack. There's multiple layers of complexity in all these questions that I would really, we don't have the time carved out today for it. So like I said, I've copy pasted onto a Word doc, and then Emily and I will work together to type out answers and responses, and then send it out maybe in a PDF or something. Yeah, so people can review and reflect on that. But I'm gonna go through, going through all these questions here. Let's see, how do you feel about, in the queer communities, some are choosing to use wife, husband for their partners since it infers dominance and patriarchy?
Sure, like how folks choose to speak about themselves or their partners. Mm-hmm. I can see how that gets complicated really quickly. I'm gonna go ahead and say, we queer folks, trans folks, particularly folks of color, particularly women, get tone policed or language policed a lot. There are a lot of folks out here trying to tell us that how we're showing up or what we're speaking is not okay, and here's how we should do it to be more effective, and this, that, and the other. So in general, unless it's actively hurting me, my inclination is to let folks call themselves and their partners however they want to. And I will use reflective language around that to the best of my ability.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, or speak to the intersection of race and impact on, other ethnic groups within the queer community?
Yeah. So I think this is really at the heart of intersectionality for me. And essentially, I believe there's a reason that a huge amount of our most brilliant justice thinkers and sort of folks that I believe have envisioned pathways to liberation are queer folks of color. I think that intersection is incredibly powerful. It's one that's incredibly oppressed, but it's also incredibly generative, because I believe that folks who experience the most oppression are the folks who are most equipped to see it clearly and to convey that to the rest of us and to help us find better pathways forward. So I think that is an absolutely critical distinction. I also think it's fraught in some ways, right? Like the queer community has been, and like the movement for queer justice has been wildly white and dominant culture and very othering of of bodies of color, of trans bodies, of lots of folks that are non-conforming to what we might see as like the mainstream white queer movement. So that's a painful, fraught history there. And we also know that within lots of communities of color, there's a fraught relationship with queerness and transness, just sort of culturally, for lots of different reasons. So it's I think, a very generative intersection, and in many ways, it's a very painful one that is sort of can be and has been steeped in oppression on both sides, often leading queer folks of color in particular to feel othered in some capacity, no matter where they are.
Yeah. So last question, and for those that didn't catch my comment earlier, there's a mix of comments, insights, reflections, and questions, and I have copy pasted them onto a Word doc. I will work with Emily on this together to get it out to you all. How do you show up as an ally and overcome microaggressions in the workplace?
Yeah. Gosh, I have actually a whole content. I was gonna put a plug in for this. Really, we talked about it the other day. A colleague of mine, Sirius, who is the one who helped me think of the Sogi Hoagie and who found the bone titty slide, are doing a series of 4 or 5 2-hour training sessions on gender justice in the workplace in particular. And then we're going to have pieces around microaggressions, around allyship. And we're going to do that in the fall, probably September, October. So hopefully we'll get that out to folks too. We're really going to be able to dive into these and dive into them in small groups and be able to be even more iterative. I think there are lots of good ways to do this based on the context. I think one of the best is to just ask for more information and be like, I'm curious about where that came from. Just sort of go towards curiousness. And that way the person who is doing the microaggressions hopefully the onus is on them to reflect about what has gone on and why they maybe went down that road. But we have, in that session of webinars, we're going to have probably a whole 2-hour set on microaggressions, on bystanding, on how to interrupt them, on how to think about them, and how to make sure that you're navigating them in the workplace towards genuine repair and growth.
Awesome, thank you. So as we're wrapping up, I just asked Brianna to put the slide back on with your contact information and your email.
Yeah.
So we'll have her put that back on if you all want to do a quick snapshot and keep Emily's information, so you could reach out if you want.
I would love to hear from folks.
Yeah.
I have quite a few colleagues and current clients that are at the state level, and it's just being able to get in and grapple with how we can make our workplaces better for all genders is really the work that I love to do. So I would love to hear from folks, and I'd love to stay in touch.
Awesome. Well, Emily, thank you so much for carving out the time. Thank you there was 500 plus, we were almost at 600 people today, for tuning in, carving out time to listen, learn, and celebrate the Pride community. And want to acknowledge that, while there is a time to celebrate, there is also time to also acknowledge that there's still harm being done in the community. And however you process things, just know, you could drop me a line, send me an email. We have I want you to know that you have a space, okay? So to share your thoughts with no judgment. So thank you all so much. We are going to end today's training session with Emily. Hope you all have a great day. Happy Pride.
Thank you all so much. Happy end of Pride Month.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.